Good morning, everyone. It is Saturday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, digital sports producer for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined today by Brian Batko, our Steelers beat reporter, for yet another Steelers NFL mock draft tracker video. How are you, Brian?
Doing well, Adam. I guess I'd be doing better if I were out there in Indy with the likes of such luminaries as Jerry Dulac and Ray Fittipaldo and Christopher Carter. But stayed home this year. So I've just been following the combine from afar. And guess it's the same deal. Guys are running 40 yards in their underwear. They are bench pressing and they are doing some football drills at Lucas Oil Stadium. So in that sense, I didn't miss much.
Yeah, and I mean, at least I get to. We're recording this on Friday. I get some fish fry tonight, so that's always a positive of staying
Where
home.
are you headed? Can you disclose that, or do you think you might be mobbed by YouTube viewers and draft gurus?
I don't know if I'll be mobbed, but I am going to St. Valentine in Bethel Park. That is my childhood parish where I went to school.
Your home court.
Yeah, so I'm used to it. I know what I'm getting, so I'm not venturing outside of that fish fry until if they don't have one, then I'll have to figure something else out. But Brian, that's enough fish talk, enough fish tales. This is our weekly video where we talk about the week in mock drafts. Obviously every week there's dozens of mock drafts that people produce on the internet. Some of them are good, some of them aren't.
I was going to say hundreds, but yeah.
Yeah, well, we talk about the ones that I find most interesting. I'll include the link to the written version down in the description, but this is the video where we discuss, basically what I found in my writing this week. The big story, obviously, in the NFL, not just, in terms of mock drafts, is Jalen Carter, the star defensive lineman for the Georgia Bulldogs, was arrested for reckless driving and racing in connection with a crash that killed a teammate of his at Georgia and a support staffer. Very sad situation, very delicate situation. But that's going to have impacts on the NFL draft. And one of the mocks that we looked at this week suggested that Jalen Carter could fall to the Steelers at number 17 and possibly be, a good fit with Pittsburgh because you have a consummate pro like Cam Hayward who could maybe help get Jalen Carter on the right path. Brian, first of all, I guess the question has to be asked this way. Do you think the Steelers would draft a player like Jalen Carter given the possible character issues related to this crash? Or do you think that that's a player that, like some other teams might choose to, they might want to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say if this is a case of you throw this player off your board entirely. I mean, I think this incident in a vacuum, not necessarily as tragic as it is. I don't think I'm breaking any news here to say that decision makers in the major sports leagues will overlook a lot of things. And if they can put just about anything out there to validate or justify taking a chance on a young man who's talented, they'll probably do that. So in this case, obviously, unless more information comes out, Carter made bad decisions and, at least in part was connected to something terrible where two people lost their lives. But it wasn't like he, robbed somebody or assaulted somebody. So I think it's something that you could explain away to the constituents that you have as a franchise, as this is a young guy. We've all done dumb things. Unfortunately, that's one night of his life that wish you could get back and you never can. So you'd hope that he'll get himself on the right track as far as just not making some of those immature decisions. Now, there is more that's slowly starting to come out, as these things tend to do when a player gets the microscope on them, that I guess the speeding has been, it wasn't just a one-time thing. I don't know that anything has happened since that accident where two lives were lost in Georgia. But I mean, there's going to be some red flag concerns that come out now. I think teams do their due diligence on every guy in that regard. There were whispers about George Pickens, last year at draft time, the classic anonymous scouts saying we don't know what he's like in the locker room. Yeah, I mean, even Anthony McFarland, I remember a couple years ago, something got published where an anonymous scout said this guy is not a team player and the coaches couldn't stand him. So I generally think that those things are, they have some merit. Otherwise, unless somebody really has an axe to grind, but you would trust that the journalists involved in reporting those would vet something like that. So the Steelers have taken players who have not been viewed as, all around, couldn't hurt a fly type guys. But in this case, I'd be surprised if Jalen Carter, had a precipitous fall like that. But I also wouldn't be surprised if he were there, if the Steelers said, yeah, we think we can get this guy doing the right things. We trust our leadership in the locker room, and maybe they just like him as a person too, because you've also heard some positive things, some good things about Jalen Carter before all this.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that the charges he's facing, I believe, are misdemeanors. They're not felonies. He's not being charged, directly with the deaths of these two people, these two individuals. It's not a manslaughter. It's not a murder type of thing. Obviously, that would be a completely different ballgame, yeah. I think. It's kind of, my understanding is that they were racing and, there was a crash and he was part of that, but he didn't. They're not charging him with being directly involved. So
I guess the biggest question people have, though, is, why did he flee the scene? Why did he mislead some police? As these things always tend to play out, he and his lawyer came out with a statement that says he will be vindicated when all the facts come out. So do you put stock into that if you're an NFL team? Do you have your own people doing some, investigations on this? It's definitely threw the combine for a loop. And, I thought he was a play, just strictly from a player standpoint, watching college football last year. I don't know that anybody jumped off the screen at me the way that 88 did for that Georgia defense. He doesn't have the most impressive statistics. Will Anderson from Alabama, I think, is the other guy that you usually hear in the running as the number one player in the draft, regardless of whether they're a quarterback or not. But every time I watched UGA, Carter he's such a beast up front, so quick off the ball, so strong. You hope that this won't, put any sort of damper on what should be a bright NFL career, and that, again, he can, keep himself on the straight and narrow here and use this as something that continues to contribute to him being a great player rather than a sad story.
I think it's impossible to speculate, how far he could drop down draft boards, given the lack of information we have at this stage. So I'm going to ask the question this way, Brian. If it gets to be, he falls into maybe bottom half of the top 10, into the maybe even somewhere between 10 and 15, is he the type of guy, given the draft capital that the Steelers have this year, that you could see them, trading up to try to get?
I'd probably make a call. Yeah. I think when you just align with everything I just said about the Jalen Carter, the player, and the needs for the Steelers, I know we're going to, get into the types of defensive linemen that maybe are on their radar. I think they could use a powerful, stout guy who can really play any technique on any defense just because of how physically gifted he is. I think he could play nose tackle in the 3-4 if they're in their, quote unquote base defense. I think he could play next to Cam Hayward in the nickel and the dime. He could rotate in. He just would be very, very tempting as a plug and play guy on your defense who would be, adding yet another elite talent to that mix. And obviously you would have him on a rookie deal for 5 years. So yeah, if it were to come down to that, and like you said, it's a lot of speculation. It's a hypothetical to the nth degree when you start getting into all of those variables. But sure, that's what we do this time of year. If you're going through a mock draft simulation and you have it on slow mode or whatever, and you see him falling and it gets to that 10 to 15 range, you've got some assets that you can package together. And Omar Khan himself said the other day that nothing is off the table. Now, how much stock do you put into that? I don't think he'd really say anything otherwise, because he's savvy enough to know that you're not going to tip your hand one way or the other. But yeah, it would make a lot of sense to me to maybe try to move up and get that guy who you think is, not only just the best player potentially in the draft, but maybe at your biggest position of need, arguably.
Going to switch gears now, Brian. One of the most interesting mock drafts I've seen in this whole process, not just this week, was from, but it did happen this week, was from Trevor Sikema at Pro Football Focus. He had the Steelers picking Darnell Wright, the offensive tackle from Tennessee, in the first round. then Keely Ringo, the cornerback from Georgia, in the second round, and Brian Brzee, the defensive lineman from Clemson, in the latter half of the second round. Brian, that sounds like an amazing first 3 picks to me, because I've seen all 3 of those guys mocked to the Steelers in the first round at different points in this process. I think I've spoken on this show about, I have concerns about Darnell Wright at number 17, because I don't know that his stock necessarily matches, a 17th overall pick. Most the mocks that I've seen that don't have the Steelers picking Darnell Wright have him going, in the later half of the first round, maybe even in the second round. But I think if you get those 3 names together, are very intriguing to me.
Yeah, and that would line up with, I think it was Daniel Jeremiah from NFL.com, who I think is one of the best people who does this. I mean, he's a former scout with Ravens, Eagles, and I think another team too. So I always, take what he has to say pretty seriously. And he said on a conference call the other day that he thinks with 3 picks in the top 49, the Steelers can get 3 day 1 starters. I tend to agree with him if they play their cards right and, they don't go for a luxury pick, if you will. But yeah, I mean, that trio right there, I also think you could put them in essentially any order and it would possibly make sense. We're still
Right.
a while away, but yeah, I could see Brzee going 17th. I could see Ringo going in the mid first round. And, if any of them were there at 49, I think I'd be hard pressed to not run that card up to the podium. So Wright I like because I think he's pretty versatile. He played a lot of different positions on the O-line at Tennessee, and the Steelers, I don't know, are necessarily married to what position they need the most on the O-line. So that could be a good fit for him. It's not like they're a team that says, we need a definite left tackle and we're not sure Darnell Wright can play there. If that's not where he goes, if he moves inside to guard, then he can also still help you. And maybe you find out if he's a tackle later on, but you could plug and play him on the interior right away. As far as Ringo, I mean, we've talked about him on this show. I mean, they haven't had a corner like him, and I think we're going to discuss another similar type of cornerback who, I don't think will be a first rounder, but could be in that second round discussion a little bit later in this video. And then Brzee, I mean, he's a guy that I've been high on from the start. I think we talked about him a couple weeks ago here. I just think he's a really powerful defensive lineman. I think he's the type of player that, other than Cam Hayward, they don't really have on their roster at this moment. They've been trying to chase a Stephon Tuitt type. I don't think DeMarvin Leal is that. He's more of a hybrid. And when you look at some of the other top D linemen in this draft, they're more hybrid or tweeners to me, whereas Brzee is just a straight up bull rush you, knock you back. He didn't, from what I saw, he didn't do great on the bench press. There were a few guys who put up more reps than him, but I still think functional football power, there's a lot to like with him. So I wouldn't even hate taking a bet on his pedigree at 17. So obviously if he were there at 49, I would not hesitate for a second, even though he's got some injury questions. And because of that, the production at Clemson wasn't all that impressive.
Yeah, I think these are all upside plays, Brian, because I think I think there's flaws in all 3 guys' games, but they're things that you can reasonably fix. With Wright, I think it's the run blocking. Obviously, he, I keep saying the stat because it amazes me. He did not allow a single sack last season at Tennessee.
He's a large man and a wide body, and doing that in the SEC is really impressive. I feel like his coming out party maybe was in that Alabama game where they upset the Tide.
Yeah. So, he's got to get better in run blocking, but if you're starting from a point of he's just not going to allow sacks, I think that's a good place to start from with any young offensive lineman. Ringo is very young. He's 20 years old. So there would need to be some development there with him, but he has all the physical tools. And then Brzee, like you mentioned, has the injury history. I think he's only played 12 games the last 2 seasons. So, he'd have to prove that he can stay healthy, but that's how you get 3 day 1 starters, right, Brian? That's
how you get guys that drop, yeah, because teams aren't sure about those things.
And I think if you get a guy you feel really good about at 17, you can take some bigger swings with those second round picks. Help that you can develop those guys and make things better. So that's why I kind of and I completely agree with you when you say you could put them in any order. And I think that's what I found intriguing about this mock draft was, I don't know how I feel about Darnell Wright at 17, but if you tell me I get all 3 of those players, I think that's a pretty good haul. So Check that out, Pro Football Focus this week. I thought that was one of the more interesting ones. We talked about Keely Ringo. I wanted to talk about another cornerback because our guys on the scene, you mentioned them, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo, they said in the last video, the Friday edition of the North Shore Drive, that they think it's possible the Steelers are going to miss out on all three of the big cornerbacks in this draft. That's Joey Porter Jr., Devin Witherspoon, and Christian Gonzalez from Oregon. So that means if they're going to go for a corner in this draft, they're going to have to look somewhere else. I think Ringo should definitely be high on the radar, to be one of those guys. But another guy who was brought up this week by Luke Easterling from Draft Wire was Delonte Banks, the cornerback from Maryland. He jumps off the page to me, especially, Brian, because Mike Tomlin has to know him pretty well, considering his son has spent so much time at Maryland. That means, Mike Tomlin's gotten an up-close look at this guy. Banks is known for, having all the size, the speed, the athletic package that NFL teams are looking for. The big concern for them is anticipation and awareness. Where do you land on Banks as a prospect that the Steelers might need to look at in that, maybe B category of cornerbacks?
Yeah, I believe he also only has 2 career interceptions at Maryland, one last season, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I mean, you would assume that Mike Tomlin has a decent amount of familiarity with any Terrapins player, unless it's a one-year guy who was only there last season or something. But even then, he's very close with Maryland coach Mike Loxley. He's a longtime friend of the Tomlin family. That could be part of why they've been so comfortable taking Maryland players in recent years, whether it was Antoine Brooks or Anthony McFarland, Derwin Gray. They have not been shy about using some mid-round picks on guys from that program. Now, not many of them have panned out lately. We do know that, but I think in this case, Banks is somebody who intrigues me because, as you alluded to, he's 6'2", 205, pretty much same dimensions as Ringo. Kind of like I was talking about with the D-line, I don't think the Steelers secondary has a corner like this. On his best day, I'd say James Pierre is, but that's an undrafted free agent who has mostly played on special teams and hasn't always held up well when he's been asked to play a lot of snaps defensively. So my point is, Cam Sutton, assuming he's back, which it sounded promising based on Omar Khan's presser the other day, and then Levi Wallace, who we almost know for sure will return, and even Akello Witherspoon if he's back. I mean, all three of those guys, I would say, are, tell me if you agree, are more finesse corners. They're more make plays on the ball when it's in the air, read eyes, jump a route, pick off a pass. Whereas, the Steelers don't have that big physical press you at the line of scrimmage, win contested catches. And we saw, that went poorly last year against the Eagles when A.J. Brown was just a physical specimen dominating them when the ball was in the air. That's why I would be intrigued to go get a player like that. Whether it's Deonte Banks, I don't know, because I think this is a deep corner class, and you could persuade me that, yeah, why don't you even just wait until the 3rd round and see who falls to you and get value elsewhere and still feel like you're coming out of it with somebody who can start for you right away at corner. So as a player, he seems decent. I just wonder if there's going to be great value with him there. And I think Ringo, coming from Georgia, I'd be a little bit more inclined to take a chance, take a big swing on a Georgia skill position player who's got great size, great pedigree, but hasn't always put it all together on the field. That sounds a little bit familiar to me. Cough, cough, George Pickens. You have to think the Steelers like the decision they made on him so far. If Ringo can be the cornerback version of that, that would be a mighty fine draft haul for them wherever they get them.
Yeah, I think the thing about Banks that gives me a little bit of heebie-jeebies is, the awareness and the kind of business of football type of stuff, not the physical stuff. Because I think, anyone who's paying attention gets Artie Burns vibes, right? Like Artie Burns had that total package. He wasn't the guy the Steelers wanted. They wanted William Jackson, but you looked at him at the time and you said, this is a guy who should be able to develop well as a corner, and he just didn't.
I think Burns was more, I think he was more of a slight player. I don't know that he was quite as filled out as Deonte Banks is, and maybe a little bit more projection was there with Burns. I mean, he was viewed as really raw coming out of Miami. He ran track in the spring, so he wasn't with the football team year round. So I think there were some questions about, like, hey, if you're going to if you're going to try to mold him like a ball of clay, you better get the developmental part right, or he better be completely bought in from an above the neck standpoint. And, one or both of those things fell through with Burns. I don't know that Banks is quite as much of a projection from the college to the pro level, but yeah, I mean, you're right in the sense that he's not as refined as some of these other players. If he was, we'd be talking about him in the middle of the first round or higher.
Right. I mean, we'd be talking about him with those three guys that we've been talking about so much on this show, and now it feels like we're kind of pivoting away, and we're going to have to really, more investigate that second layer. But that's what makes draft season fun, Brian, is that things change, and we're not talking about the same players all the time. So I'm excited to get to maybe know that next layer and see how that might impact the Steelers draft plans. Another name that came up in Luke Easterling's, I think it was a 2-round mock draft on DraftWire, was Keon White. He was actually the first pick. He is the Georgia Tech defensive lineman. He has a lot of, again, I feel like that was kind of the theme of the week with our mock draft tracker, is that he's got the size, he's got the athleticism, he's got all that stuff that gets scouts excited, especially at something like the combine, football in shorts. But when, it gets to the actual technique, there's been some criticism of his ability to have the moves to get to the passer. I found that interesting because last week on the show, Christopher Carter was our guest, and he brought up how, at Steelers training camp his rookie year, TJ Watt didn't necessarily have those moves either, that those are something he's developed over the years to go from being, maybe not the most polished pass rusher at Wisconsin to being, arguably the gold standard in the NFL. Do you look at a guy like Keon White that we haven't talked about as much as maybe a similar type of player where, he definitely has some things to work on, but under the tutelage of a guy like TJ Watt, maybe he could become a monster in the same way Watt has?
Yeah, I just don't know that you need that player right now versus some other positions. Like to me, it's similar to the Lucas Van Ness conversation. He was put on the Post-Gazette radar when our own Ray Fittipaldo mocked him to the Steelers in his initial draft of this offseason. I think he and White are kind of similar in the sense that they're like these, if you want to call them a hybrid or a big edge player, they play with their hand in the dirt in college, but obviously if you go to the pros, how are the Steelers going to use you in their system? Are you going to be, a 5 technique, or are you going to be somebody who also can kind of rush it from that quote unquote outside linebacker spot at times? To me, I feel like you kind of got that guy last year in DeMarvin Leal. Granted, that was in the 3rd round. I don't know that he's the type of, high upside prospect that Van Ness or White is, but, I just think in terms of using your draft resources, don't you want to kind of trust your evaluation and hope that this somewhat similar, at least to me, player, is given a chance to pan out for you so that you can go use a high pick to fortify things elsewhere? I mean, White himself might just stand out to them as, we can't pass on this guy if he's there. He's too good. I mean, he's 6'5", 280. He didn't run the 40 yesterday. I'm not sure why, but he did positional drills. And if you pull it up on Twitter, I mean, he moves like a wide receiver. It's pretty freaky to see what he does. He put up 30 bench press reps at that size. He jumped 34 inches vertical leap. So, I mean, he is a specimen. You always wonder, though, you don't want the workout warrior necessarily. You want somebody who can do it on the field. I feel like the draft experts believe in his film. Did a lot of different things for that Georgia Tech defense, rushing the passer, obviously, but I think he also dropped back and covered some running backs out of the backfield occasionally. So he's also noted as a very smart football player. You would think that from a Georgia Tech guy. We'll see where his stock ultimately ends up. It feels like he's really all over the place. Some analysts love him. Some don't like him nearly as much. He had 7.5 sacks last season, so maybe that gives people some pause. But yeah, I think he'd be a little bit too much of a luxury for me because, again, where do you play him if you're the Steelers? Is he going to be in your best 11 more often than not? Probably not initially, at least not if Larry Ogunjobi is back. And also, I'm in the camp that thinks that TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith still have a lot of good years together, and Highsmith's going to get a new deal. So at that point, you're looking at potentially a number 3 edge rusher. Is that guy worth using a high pick on?
Yeah, it's tough because the coin of the realm in the NFL right now is pass rushing, and you want that, but also to your point, do you want to invest premium resources in a position where you have guys you feel pretty good about? And I think the Steelers have plenty of reason, like you said, to feel good about TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith. The other side of that is we saw this year what happens when TJ Watt gets hurt and how it changes the defense entirely. All three levels are different because of his absence, and maybe there's something to be said for having three guys that you can find ways to get them on the field together.
Or when one's off the field, there's minimal drop off. Yeah, I mean, I get it. Positionless football, so to speak, is kind of in vogue. But last I checked, you still need guys in your secondary, and you still need to have a well-rounded unit.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that too. I think we saw flashes of that with the safeties this season. Finding ways to get Demonte Casey on the field and stuff. So. I think it'd be an interesting choice if the Steelers made it, but I think there's lots of other options that we've talked about today as well. Brian, before we wrap up, did you have any other observations from the NFL Combine? Not necessarily things we've talked about on the mock draft tracker, but just, you watch a lot of these drills, you follow what's going on in Indianapolis. With regard to the Steelers, was there anything that jumped off the page at you?
I think Joey Porter Jr., of course, is always going to be an interesting one. The confidence that he has, we'll see if he ultimately makes it to where the Steelers would want to take him. But he certainly believes in himself and believes in some of those technique issues that he has. And I think I've got a 3-year-old who's trying to give me his draft analysis over here, Adam. So, I'll be curious to see how he tests today and see what all he does. Yeah, Joey Porter, that is, not my toddler.
Yeah, I think Joey Porter Jr. is the name that has been connected to the Steelers the most often, and maybe that will change, maybe it won't. Maybe he will still be available in that 15 to 17 range, and he'll be a guy that the Steelers go after. And we're talking about all these names for no reason. We'll see. But that's what makes draft season interesting.
I mean, look what we were doing last year. We were ad nauseum analyzing Malik Willis, Desmond Ridder, Matt Corral, Sam Howe, and turned out that the guy that we've had on our, I was going to say on our minds and hearts, but that's pretty corny. But Steelers fans had him on their heart, or Pitt fans had him on their hearts. Kenny Pickett. He was in the building for 5 years, and that's ultimately who they decided on. But what do we do this time of year? We waste a lot of airtime. We waste a lot of ink on hundreds of players, many of whom will never wear the black and gold. But that's what makes draft season fun.
Absolutely. So I think that wraps up another great mock draft tracker video. Brian, thanks for joining me. Enjoy your fish fry if you have some. Otherwise, we'll talk to you.
They're always too crowded anymore. I mean, unless if I'm a VIP at one like you seem to be, but.
You got to call. You got to call ahead, or like order online, because now you can order online. They're really the options available to you are really changing. You don't have to just walk in and order it and wait. And granted, last week there were a few kinks in the system, but you got to expect that. It's not a restaurant, folks. Fish fries are volunteers. A lot of good people out there. So I'm looking forward to getting my fish tonight. Brian, thanks for joining me, and we'll join you all again next week to talk more draft prospects. Just a reminder, if you're joining us for the first time, please like this video. Help us out with the YouTube algorithm. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any videos. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo, who were in Indy, will be back with a lot more draft talk next week. So make sure you're signed up to check all of that out. And of course, the subscription deal down in the description, $6 for 6 months of access to Post-Gazette.com. Everything I'm writing, everything Brian's writing, everything all of our Steelers beat reporters are publishing during the week. You can get access to that for $1 a month. It's a great deal, so check it out. And with that, we're going to let you go. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you liked the video, please like it and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed it on Apple Podcasts, please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. For 6 months of digital access to Post-Gazette.com for just $6, click the link down in the description.